Hey guys, I'm going to be doing a close reading for you for this reading text that I posted on the 28th. Tonight you have due this journal entry that is referring back to this reading. Since I was sick yesterday, as I said in class, you have another day to turn this in because I want you to have the opportunity to read through it with me and hear what I have to say about it. So this journal entry is about the perspective of the explorers and what it would be like if they viewed the natives differently. And it's based on this reading. This reading is 9 pages long. I'm going to go ahead and open it up. And we talked a little bit about it in class, but I'm going to go through and read parts of it so that we can kind of talk through what the text is saying until you have someone reading this text to you. So on page 1. Where my cursor is where I'm going to be reading, and I'm going to do one paragraph at a time. I may pause and give some additional information as I read. Arawak men and women, naked, tawny, and full of wonder, emerged from their villages into the island's beaches and swam out to get a closer look at the strange big boat. When Columbus and his sailors came ashore carrying swords, speaking oddly, the Arawaks ran to greet them, brought them food, water, gifts. He later wrote this in his log, he meaning Christopher Columbus. Like we said in class, there's this big indented bit of text. That means it's quoted from somewhere else. So this is Christopher Columbus's logs. He says, Columbus says, they, meaning the natives, brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. Their spears are made out of cane. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. So that's him talking about the natives. Next paragraph. These Arawaks of the Bahama Islands are much like Indians on the mainland, who were remarkable, European observers were to say again and again. They were remarkable for their hospitality, their belief in sharing, and these traits did not stand out in the Europe of the Renaissance, dominated as it was by the religion of popes, the government of kings, the frenzy for money that marked Western civilization and its first messenger to the Americas, Christopher Columbus. So I'm taking an aside. The explorers and people who came from Europe were very surprised by the way the islanders and the Native Americans operated. They didn't understand the generosity and the hospitality. And you'll notice that when the explorers talk about the natives, they mention their bodies. And a lot of that has to do with them looking for servants or looking for slaves. The main purpose of the explorers was to bring wealth back to Europe and the prospective countries. So Christopher Columbus was trying to find wealth for Spain. And so wealth comes in the form of different goods, but as well as slaves and servants. Columbus wrote, as soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts. So he's capturing humans, and in his perspective, he's saying, well, I can teach them things about me, but also I want them to tell me where the gold is or where the riches are. The information that Columbus wanted most was, where's the gold? He had persuaded the king and queen of Spain to finance an expedition to the lands. The wealth he had expected would be on the other side of the Atlantic. So he thought he was going to Asia. He thought he was going to the Indies in Asia. So he thought he was looking for gold and spices because it was known that those things were available there. For like other informed people of his time, he knew the world was round and he could sail west in order to get to the Far East. We're here in Spain. Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation states like France, England, and Portugal. Its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. Pause right there. So the discrepancy of wealth in Spain was pretty wide. if 2% of the population owns all of the wealth and 95% of the land, and then the rest of the people in Spain were there working. So already the people who have money to send out explorers and to support these missions have their own idea of what success looks like, and they're already used to having very poor people work for them and do kind of perform in a governing or ownership role of smaller incomed people, or be responsible for that. Here's my cursor right here on Spain. Spain had tied itself to the Catholic Church, expelled all the Jews, driven out the Moors. Like other states of the modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. So this is all about accumulating power. And one way that they did that was by centralizing religion and making it a Catholic state, which was very popular in Europe during this time. Not all of them, but most of the monarchs, the kings and queens or whatever, would have a specific religion that the country would follow. And religion was very closely tied to power during that time. Here's my cursor. There was gold in Asia, it was thought, and certainly silks and spices, for Marco Polo and others had brought back marvelous things from their overland expeditions centuries before. So Columbus is basing his idea of travel and finding gold on things that Marco Polo did before him. Now that the Turks had conquered Constantinople and the Eastern Mediterranean and controlled the land routes to Asia, a sea route was needed. So they're basically saying there's no direction by land from Spain that they could go to Asia to look for these riches. So they're trying to find a way to get there by boat. So Portuguese sailors were working their way around the southern tip of Africa. So they were going south and trying to go around Africa to get to Asia. But Spain decided to gamble on a long sail across an unknown ocean. So what we know as the Atlantic Ocean, they thought if they just sailed straight across the Atlantic Ocean, they would land in the Indies or in India and Asia. And they were wrong. They found North America. Well, found. They didn't know it was there, but indigenous people knew it was there. In return for bringing back gold and spices, they promised Columbus 10% of the profits, governorship over newfound lands, and the fame that would come with a new title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He was a merchant's clerk from the Italian city of Genoa, part-time weaver, the son of a skilled weaver, and an expert sailor. He set out with 3 sailing ships, the largest of which was the Santa Maria, perhaps 100 feet long and 39 crew members. Columbus would have never made it to Asia, which was thousands of miles further than he had calculated, imagining a smaller world, so he didn't think it would be that far. He would have been doomed by the great expanse of sea, but he was lucky. 1/4 of the way there, he came upon an unknown, uncharted land that lay between Europe and Asia, the Americas. It was early October 1492, and 33 days since he and his crew had left the Canary Islands off the Atlantic coast of Africa. Now they saw branches and sticks floating in the water. They saw flocks of birds. These were the signs of land. Then on October 12th, a sailor called Rodrigo saw the early morning moon shining on the white sands and cried out. It was an island in the Bahamas, the Caribbean Sea. The first man to sight land was supposed to get a yearly pension. He didn't. Columbus claimed he'd seen a light the night before, and he was given the reward. So, approaching land, they were met by the Arawak Indians, who swam out to greet them. The Arawaks lived in village communes, had a developed agriculture of corn, yams, and cassava, and they could spin and weave, but they had no horses or work animals. They had no iron, but they wore tiny gold ornaments in their ears. And that was, having those gold ornaments and jewelry was kind of what made Columbus so adamant that he was going to find gold where he was. So he captured some of them and took them as prisoners and insisted that they would help him find the gold. I was summarizing, but here we are. He then sailed to what's now Cuba, then to Hispaniola, the island which today consists of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So he was on the Haitian and Dominican Republic islands. So, and there they could see little bits of gold in the rivers, which is something you can see around here too sometimes. And someone gave Columbus a golden mask, one of the native chiefs did. And so he was, of course, convinced that there was gold. Okay, I'm skipping down to this part. I'm going to summarize this pretty quickly. So from the original ship that they brought over, they decided to turn that into a fort. So basically build a fort there on the island. And he called the islands, or he called the fort, I should say, Navidad, which means Christmas. And he left 39 of his crew members there, and their job was to try and find more gold. He took some prisoners with him and took them back to Spain, basically was his plan. Okay, so I'm going to start again right here. At one part of the island, he got into a fight with Indians who refused to trade as many bows and arrows as he and his men wanted. 2 of the Indians were run through with swords and bled to death. Then the Niña and Pinta set sail for Azores in Spain. When the weather turned cold, the Indian prisoners began to die because they weren't used to that sort of weather. And they probably were not being cared for very well. So by many accounts, Columbus would kind of take what he wanted and did not treat the Native Americans there, or I guess I should, the natives there with very much respect. And he wasn't really caring about what they might want. He was really interested in gold and what he wanted to bring back to Spain. So of course he gets back to Spain and he's selling the story. He wants them to know, oh, there's so much gold, there's great spices, there's great slaves, give me more money and I will bring this to you. So here's what he says down here in this little area. Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, which the majority contain gold. There are many spices and great mines of gold and other metals. He also goes on to talk about the natives, and he would say they are so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it. So the idea that they would be generous and give the things they had to visitors was very unnatural to someone who's coming from Spain and coming from the community and the social setup in Spain, where there's people hold on to power and money and hold it over other people. He mentioned that when you ask the natives for something, they never say no. And to the contrary, actually, they offer to share with everybody. He concluded his report by asking for a little help from their majesties, the king and queen. And in return, he would bring them from his next voyage as much gold as they need and as many slaves as they ask. So he's making big promises to the king and queen of Spain. He also is full of religious talk. You'll see this time and time again as they're kind of using the Catholic Church and language of the church to justify some of the things that they're doing. So they say here, thus the eternal God, our Lord, gives victory to those who follow his way over apparent impossibilities. So basically what he's saying is that because we love God and we serve him, he's given us a victory here. And so it almost entitles him to ownership of the people and the things in the Americas. So you'll see that time and time again from many different groups using religion as a means for claiming power and claiming sovereign power. So Columbus didn't invent that. Okay, starting again right here. Because of Columbus's exaggerated reports and promises, his second expedition was given 17 ships and more than 1,200 men. The aim was clear, slaves and gold. They went from island to island in the Caribbean, taking Indians as captives, but as word spread of the Europeans' intent, they found more and more empty villages. On Haiti, they found that the sailors left behind at Fort Navidad had been killed in a battle with the Indians after they had roamed the island in gangs looking for gold, taking women and children as slaves for sex and labor. So the native populations are becoming aware that this is a threat, that the people coming from in the ships are not friends. They're not coming to build a positive relationship, but they're coming to basically steal, loot from the Native Americans. So the Native Americans are starting to fight back. And I guess so now from his base on Haiti, this is where we are here, Columbus sends an expedition, sends expedition after expedition into the interior. So he's trying to go further and see if he can find more gold, because he's not really seeing anything where he's at. They still found no gold fields, but they still had to fill up their ships with some sort of dividend to bring back to Spain, because the monarchs, the king and queen, invested money and they expected a return. Okay, so in the year of 1495, they went on a great slave raid, rounded up 1,500 Arawak men, women, and children, put them in pens guarded by the Spaniards and dogs, and then picked the 500 best specimens to load onto the ships. So in saying that, they're basically choosing the most physically fit that would be of human bodies that would be able to be sold most successfully as slaves. So they couldn't find gold, so in their minds, stealing people was the next best thing. And of those 500, 200 died on the trip back to Spain. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this. Too many of the slaves died in captivity, which we were talking about, and Columbus is really desperate to pay back the people who had invested in him and his excavation. So he goes to Haiti, or back to Haiti, I should say, and where he had thought there were going to be giant gold fields, they decided to enslave, or maybe they already had, but they continued to enslave the native people. Anyone who was over 14 years old had to collect a certain quantity of gold every 3 months. When they brought it, they were given copper tokens to hang around their necks. Indians found without a copper token had their hands cut off and they bled to death. So pretty vicious punishment for those who did not comply. But as it states here, the natives actually in that situation were given an impossible task because there wasn't that much gold. There was only little bits around in streams, little dust, and so many of them tried to run away and then were often hunted down with dogs and killed. So I'm going to kind of not breeze over, but kind of summarize as I go, because I don't want to just read it to you. So many of the Arawaks tried to rebel. They tried to fight back or resist. Many of them were killed, and they began to lose so much hope that they even just began committing suicide or and other pretty atrocious things, because the Arawaks couldn't really even imagine escaping. In 2 years, about half of the 250,000 natives on Haiti were dead. And it became clear that there was no gold left, and the natives were still taken as slaves. And so by the year 1515, there were perhaps 50,000 natives left, but by 1550, there were 500. And 100 years later, they showed that there were no original Arawaks or their descendants left on the island. So that culture, that whole people was completely wiped out by Columbus and by the way that they were searching for gold and using the natives there. So so this text, it's going back and forth from Howard Zinn, the author. So he's giving us some information as we go. As a reminder, this is the text. It's my only one copy, but I'd love to get more. So one of the many sources of what happened on the islands after Columbus came is Bartolomé de las Casas, or Las Casas. He was a young priest, and he came over, but he was really turned off by the way the Spaniards were treating the natives. And so For a time, when he first came, I'm starting here where my cursor is, for a time he owned a plantation on which Indian slaves worked, but he gave that up and became a vehement critic of Spanish cruelty. So Las Casas transcribed Columbus's journal, and in his 50s began a multi-volume history of the Indies, and in it he describes the natives in a lot of detail. So there's a lot of detail here. He's giving examples about the way, just the very different cultural norms in the native culture, or that only in that specific one. So he's talking about the ways that native or marriage laws were non-existent, and the way that women were kind of free to choose relationships and go, you know, as they wished. What's very different is that at this time in Europe, women were pretty much thought of as property, so very similar to the way the Western view of the people in the Americas. Women were not given rights to vote, they couldn't work, they had to, they basically were kind of tied to men in the Western world. So this is some examples of different ways that the Native women in those communities were able to have different relationships. And when it says sex relations, it means like, basically like it would be the opposite of having, or the equivalent, I should say, of having like marital relations. So they just didn't have marriage. It wasn't an institution. They also didn't really have religion in the same way that Europeans did. So there was this whole other way of life that was very different. So I will say, let's pick up here. They prize bird feathers of various colors, beads made of fish bones, and green and white stones, which they adorn their ears and lips. But they put no value on gold or other precious thing. And here's his perspective of how they deal with ownership and goods. They lack all manner of commerce, neither buying nor selling, and rely exclusively on their natural environment for maintenance. They are extremely generous with their possessions, and by the same token covet the possessions of their friends and expect the same degree of liberality. So basically the idea of ownership and hoarding things was not something that he saw present in this particular people. So that made them very vulnerable to a Western culture that was more interested in taking and hoarding and keeping, because to the natives, everything belonged to everyone. So that idea of reciprocity and sharing was more present, and that was something that was taken advantage of by the explorers. Okay. There's a few more things in here. It goes into describe in great detail the way the natives and the slaves were treated. So even as far as Spaniards refusing to walk, being carried by natives, making natives carry shades for them, and then just that idea of total control seemed by his account to lead to cruelty. And so there was a lot of meaningless or purposeless killing of the people and the slaves, because they were looked at as but subhuman. And when the natives tried to defend themselves, they often failed and were killed. So they suffered as working in the mines, and often it was just kind of backbreaking work that they had to keep doing, or else they were killed. So there's a lot of details in here. The men of the natives were sent away many miles to the mines, and the wives remained where they were, but they were first forced to basically do farming to sustain the Spanish encampments. And so they didn't really get to see each other often. So husbands and wives were separated. Children often died because they weren't able to sustain themselves. I'm going to go through some more of this. He did say that there were 60,000 people living on this island, including the Indians. so that from 1494 to 1508, over 3 million people had perished from war, slavery, and the mines. Who in future generations will believe this? I myself, writing it as a knowledgeable eyewitness, can hardly believe. Thus began the history 500 years ago of the European invasion of the Indian settlements in the Americas. That beginning, when you read Las Casas, even if his figures are exaggerations, were there 3 million Indians to begin with, as he says, or less than 1 million, as some historians have calculated, or 8 million, as others now believe? The story is conquest, slavery, and death. When we read the history books given to children in the United States, it starts with heroic adventure. There's no bloodshed, and Columbus Day is a celebration. Often past elementary and high schools, there are only occasional hints of something else. We're going to go through some of this. This is the author. This is Zinn kind of talking through why he wrote this book, to provide other accounts, because sometimes this narrative is missing when we talk about history, especially the colonization of America. We're going to keep going. We've already kind of read through it, but he does go on to talk about another book that was written called Christopher Columbus Mariner, and he talks about the enslavement and the killing of the natives as saying the cruel policies initiated by Columbus and pursued by his successors resulted in complete genocide. This is a really big deal. Genocide is a really big deal to wipe out a complete group of people. So it's important that when we talk about Columbus, that we talk about this. We're going to go down a little bit. People have also, I'm going to read through this. This is a perspective about Columbus. And this is also talking about, this is about from the same book. He says, he had his faults, meaning Columbus, and defects, but they were largely the defects of the qualities that made him great. His indomitable will, his superb faith in God, and his own mission as the Christ-bearer to lands beyond the seas. His stubborn persistence despite neglect, poverty, and discouragement. But there was no flaw, no dark side to this most outstanding and essential of all his qualities, his seamanship. Meaning, he's saying, yeah, he did some bad things, but he also did all these amazing things as well. So this is all more about how you want to view history, and we're going to read a little bit about it. One can lie outright about the past, or one can omit facts which might lead to unacceptable conclusions. Morrison, the guy who just wrote what we just read, does neither. He refuses to lie about Columbus. He does not omit the story of mass murder. Indeed, he describes it with the harshest word one can use, genocide. But he does something else. He mentions the truth quickly and goes on to other things that are more important to him. Outright lying or quiet omission takes the risk of discovery, which, when made, might arouse the reader to rebel against the writer. To state the facts, however, and then to bury them in a mass of other information is to say to the reader with a certain infectious calm, yes, mass murder took place, but it's not that important. It should weigh very little in our final judgment. It should affect very little of what we do in the world. So Zinn, the guy who wrote our book, he's saying you can't just say, oh yeah, there was a little bit of murder, there was a little bit of genocide, and then all of this other great stuff happened. So he's kind of analyzing why people don't talk about this part of Columbus. Here we go. It is not that the historian can avoid emphasis on some facts and not of others. This is as natural to him as to the map maker, who, in order to produce a usable drawing for practical purposes, must first flatten and distort the shape of the earth, then choose out the bewildering mass of geographical information, those things needed for the purpose of this or that particular map. Okay, this is a lot of wordy definition, and basically what he's saying is that a historian, someone who tells these stories in a history book, can't just, he can't give all the details everywhere, just like when we're looking at our maps. Some things have to be smoothed over or flattened because you want to get the general picture. So the the general idea is that over time, we've kind of neglected a lot of the stories of Columbus because what people have deemed to be the most important thing are that he is the man who discovered America. So we're kind of changing the rhetoric around that when we talk about it, because you can't really discover something that is already known to thousands of people. But historians in the past, when we're talking about the origins of North America and the United States as we know it, we have to talk about Columbus, because that European influence is what basically kicked things off for the society and the government that we have now. So when we talk about that, sometimes the desire is just to get through the facts of how A became B became C and get down the road. But it's important to consider all of the pieces that went into the creating of this country, and rather than kind of do a glossed over version, I want to make sure that we really look at both sides. Not that it's both sides, but we're going to go down a little bit more right here. I read this in class today. This is kind of the takeaway as to why we're looking at this text and why we're reading through a lot of it. So to emphasize the heroism of Columbus and his successors as navigators and discoverers, and to de-emphasize their genocide, is not a technical necessity, but it is an ideological choice. It serves unwittingly to justify what was done. So when we look at a history book that doesn't include something like genocide, it doesn't necessarily mean that well, let me take that back. It does mean that the goal of whoever wrote the book is to give a picture of maybe success, or to maybe just more quickly get to the facts of how the Spaniards came and how they then started, other Europeans came, and then we started doing colonies, and then we split from England and all of those things. A lot of times that choice to negate that can often give the people learning that a sense that that all the other stuff was necessary, or that it is that it can be justified. And so I think it's important to know that we can hold both things equally. We can say that, part of what Christopher Columbus did in fact lead to where we are now, but there's tension there, because also there was a great atrocity committed, and there were several atrocities committed as we go through US history. And so just kind of holding both ideas and learning about those perspectives as we move forward is really important. So we just want to be careful when we treat someone like Columbus as a hero, or as, Columbus Day is approaching, we want to talk about, what does that look like to someone who is a descendant of a Native American, people who are Native Americans? What does that look like? So we're going to continue thinking about it, and we're going to continue reading more about Columbus and thinking about perspectives. So I encourage you to think about the journal prompt, and what you're going to be writing in the journal prompt is basically, what do you think would happen if Columbus had had a different view of the natives, if he hadn't been so quick to think that they were slow or backwards, or look at them as slaves? What do you think could have happened in the long run? So it's kind of a creative option, and I want you to really start thinking about perspectives and why they mean so much in our writing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this long, close reading, and I'm excited to do more.